St. Patrick, Oscar Wilde, and Guinness beer. Today, we're talking about a trip to Ireland. Here at Travel Lemming, our team is always on the go, and our founder, Nate, had the pleasure of interviewing one of our fantastic editors, Abigail, about her 10-day road trip through Ireland. In addition to that, we're going to be discussing great travel photography tips, an AI influencer in Germany, a new cheap flight finder, as well as a new tourist ban in Europe. I'm your host, Betty Hurd, and this is the Travel Lemming podcast. Here we talk about all things travel, from tips, tricks, perspectives, opinions, you name it. If that sounds like your cup of tea, make sure to like and subscribe. We've got a great show for you today. I am joined by my co-host, Nate Hake, who's also the founder of Travel Lemming. How are you doing today, Nate?
Hi, Betty. Happy to be here. I am in Cancun for a couple days before I catch a flight out to San Francisco. For listeners who were listening to our last podcast, where I was in the neighboring state of the Yucatan, I did end up taking the Maya train, which is that brand new train that they have, from Merida to Cancun yesterday. Super cool train. I want to come back and take it because it stops in the center of all these cool colonial towns and really enjoy that trip. But it opens up so many destinations from Cancun because it goes right to the airport and they have this giant station. So that was super cool. I'm sitting here in Cancun, not in a beach hotel, but I do have this nice Ferris wheel behind me. For those of you who are on YouTube, going to spend a couple days here, maybe try to get some time out on the beach.
That is very cool. I actually was just in Cancun as well, but I was just there for weddings, so I didn't get to experience any of the cool stuff that you got to see. So hopefully I get that opportunity soon. But we're going to go ahead and dive into what's new in travel. Nate, you want to kick us off on that?
Yeah, so the first story that I have today is that the German National Tourist Board, so this is the official organization that promotes tourism to Germany, has announced that they have, quote, hired an AI influencer. And her name, or its name, is Emma. And Emma is not German. She has a British accent. There's one reel on her Instagram where she talks about how she is going to be sharing her travels and experiences as she ventures through Germany.
Hi, I am Emma, and I am the first AI influencer of travel destination Germany. I'm excited to take you on an amazing journey through this fascinating and inspiring country.
And it's all AI, and it looks like an AI reel. This has generated a ton of reaction online. The comments have not been positive. There are a lot of travel bloggers, a lot of travel creators that are really responding with all sorts of snarky comments. I think one of my favorites was, I hope that she promotes AI tourists visiting and spending AI euros in Germany. Certainly, as you know, we're travel creators, this is a bit concerning, the idea that there's just going to be AI influencer out there. At the same time, it's a new technology. So I don't know, maybe some people listening at home would be interested to plan their trip with an AI influencer. From my perspective, I feel like I want to hear from people who have actually been to the destination. I don't know. What do people think about that? What's your thoughts, Betty?
Well, I agree completely. I feel like I want to get the information and the perspectives from people who have actually been to the place, not just from a robot. And it's so weird looking her up and listening to her little British accent. She doesn't even have a German accent. She sounds like Hermione from Harry Potter. Very spooky. I didn't like it. It made me uncomfortable. And again, obviously that's the antithesis of what Travel Lemming is, and so many travel influencers. I can see why they're outraged by this, but we'll see what happens with it.
Yeah, there's so many wonderful people who have actually traveled to Germany and have actual stories and videos to share. I kind of question what's the point of this other than for them trying to just save some money or something or get attention. And maybe that's the whole point. They're getting a lot of attention out of this. So maybe it gets people thinking about Germany and that's all they care about. Let us know, listeners, what you think about this. Okay, my next story is about last time, a couple episodes ago, we were talking about how Barcelona is having problems with over-tourism. Another Spanish city, Malaga, has announced that they are banning short-term rentals. So basically Airbnbs, any sort of short-term tourist rentals like that are going to be banned in over 40 neighborhoods across the city. Now, this only applies to new rentals, but they are saying, hey, we've had enough, like too many apartment rentals, Airbnbs coming in, driving up the price of rent, driving up the cost of housing for locals, pushing locals out, and they're shutting it down. And we're starting to see this in more cities around the world. that are increasingly cracking down on Airbnbs. New York City had a big thing last year where they're putting some limits on there. And so we may be getting to a point where that market's kind of maturing. And I don't know. Maybe we could do a whole episode on this. I used to stay in a ton of Airbnbs. For many years, I basically lived out of an Airbnb. And it wasn't until last month in Merida that I stayed in my first one for over a year because I just prefer hotels because it's so much more simple. The market, and also it used to be that Airbnbs were a lot cheaper and they're not anymore. Like increasingly, it's the same price as a hotel. So I don't know. I can understand why cities kind of take this perspective.
Yeah, I just tried to book an Airbnb on a trip with my brother and his wife, and the cleaning fee was more expensive than the booking fee. So it's like at this point, I don't even try anymore. And also just went to Coronado Island in San Diego, and I know that they banned it on the island. Of course, we just booked on VRBO because that was cheaper than the hotels there. It's very expensive there. But I think a lot of companies are going to be going that way because I think locals are sick and tired of just being this influx of tourists and the prices being driven up. So it makes sense to me.
Yeah, it is nice to have a kitchen with the Airbnb. And if I had one request of hotels, I wish more of them would start to put kitchens in. But anyway, on to our next story, which is about a term I've never heard about. So American Airlines has new technology they're rolling out to crack down on what's called gate lice. I've never heard this term before, but basically what it means is people who skip the boarding line. So if they're in, for example, waiting for your plane, they're in group C and they just go ahead and go with group A and they just scan their boarding pass and they get on. And apparently this is quite a problem. I didn't even think about this as a potential problem before. And so the idea of this new technology is that if that happens and you're in group C and you scan it, a sound will come off like an alarm, and then they will, not permit you on and tell you to go wait for your thing. And maybe there'll be some social pressure from the embarrassment of this. Betty, you work all day. You're on and off planes. Betty is a flight attendant for a major airline for our listeners who don't know. Have you heard of this before? Is this a problem? And do you have any thoughts on it?
I had never heard of the term gate lice until like yesterday. So I think it's really funny because luckily I don't have to deal with these people because I'm not a gate agent. I'm on the plane already. But I don't even understand why people are always in such a rush because everyone's going to get on the plane. We're all going to leave at the same time anyway. But I know that there are scientific studies that actually show how sounds can trigger emotions and trigger anxiety. So it's kind of funny that they're doing this like scientific experiment where people are getting publicly embarrassed because they're trying to cut the line. And then this alarm goes off and then everyone around them knows that they're trying to do that. So apparently it's been working so far. I know that they've tried it out in 3 airports and it's kind of expedited the boarding process.
Public shaming absolutely would work on me. Although
Oh, me too.
probably there are some people, and maybe the type of people who are doing this anyway, who wouldn't. So who knows? Anyway, very interesting. That's what I've got for stories. How about you, Betty?
So sticking with the topic of flights and airports, Google Flights is releasing a new cheap flight finder feature, which is rolling out in November of 2024. So I guess my understanding of it is that you basically will be sacrificing your time and the convenience of getting where you want to go quickly for a very cheap flight, which means they could have you going way out of your way and laying over in some random city and then getting to where you're going because it's a less priority. You're taking a lesser priority flight, or you're even returning to an airport within your same city, but not the same one that you left from. Budget travelers are going to really love this feature, I think. So it's just, I haven't tried it out yet, but we'll see if it's a real money saver.
Yeah, it could be cool. I mean, I think the idea here is, they're just pulling together and cobbling together kind of inventory in ways that they weren't previously. A lot of people have used Skip Lag or Hopper, and both of those have gone through some legal challenges because the airlines don't like them, where people will like buy one-way flights and stuff like that. But some of this different software tries to kind of put things together. So maybe we'll find some potentially cheaper airfare. I have personally taken flights. I think the longest route I've ever taken was about 60 hours. And that was to get under $500
Brutal.
to go from the but under $500 to go from the US to Asia. Back in the day when I was younger, I was happy to trade my time for money.
You were young and spry and had energy.
Yeah.
Yeah, before I worked for the airlines, I always used Skip Lagged, and it was a similar process. So we'll see if Google Flights can do it better. And moving right along, there is an airport in New Zealand that is making headlines because of a sign that they posted in their drop-off area. It reads, "Max hug time 3 minutes For fonder farewells, please use the car park. So I guess a lot of people are outraged by this. I personally am like 3 minutes. That's plenty of time to say goodbye to whoever's dropping you off at the airport. And the CEO of the Dunedin airport actually referred to airports as hotbeds of emotion, which I think is a hilarious way to describe an airport, but it makes sense. But the whole goal was just to get people moving along and get more people into the airport and get them in and out and then not be crowding the drop-off area. So they have a car park where you can go for 15 minutes for free to say goodbye, which again, for me in the US, that sounds like a substantial amount of time, but I guess some people are not wanting that time limit on their goodbyes. What do you think of that?
I mean, at 3 minutes is more than I personally care to hug anyone. But at the same time, if you're saying goodbye to someone for a very long time with taking a long flight, I imagine that happens a lot in New Zealand because it's kind of at the end of the world. And if you're leaving New Zealand, you're
Good
probably
point.
going somewhere that's far away. So it may be that you're not seeing that person for a while. So I could understand why they would need to limit it. Obviously, there's security issues and they need to keep that traffic flowing at the entrance. So anyway, if you're, keep those hugs to 3 minutes, I guess.
Yeah, it makes sense. And then finally, we're talking about another European ban on tourists, which we discussed in our first episode, talking about Barcelona and having people out on late night pub crawls. Prague is banning evening pub crawls from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. I guess it's a huge destination for bachelor and bachelorette parties, especially from the UK. So these massive groups will come into Prague and just wreak havoc on the city, and they'll be out loud, rowdy all night long. So I get it. The locals have gotten really fed up and have been pushing for this ban for a while now. I guess it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't go out to the bars late, you can't go to the pubs. You just can't have an organized group under the title of a pub crawl. So I'm sure people will find ways around it, but hopefully the locals are pleased and tourists aren't too upset with this restriction.
So, fun fact for you, in the UK, they call bachelorette and bachelor parties hen and stag parties. And there are a ton of those
I
groups.
saw that.
Yeah. In Prague, Riga, a bunch of other cities around Europe are known for them, and they can get really rowdy. There are also those organized pub crawls that are very popular in Prague that will take as many as 100 people between places. And it seems from the story that's what they're cracking down on. I can't imagine Prague without bars. Like, what would even be the point
Right.
for a lot of travelers? But they're just trying to keep those really big groups who can get really rowdy.
So that wraps up what's new in travel. We're going to go ahead and move right along to our favorite travel lemming perspectives. If you go to our main website and scroll down, you'll find our perspectives. And this is a whole bunch of great articles written by our very talented team about basically just travel opinions and their experiences abroad. And Nate and I chose our favorite ones from this week. Starting with Meg's piece on why she prefers to travel alone. It's titled, I prefer to travel alone and here's why. And I am agreed with a lot of what she discussed in this. Basically, she talks about personalization on a trip without sacrifice. Waking up when you want to, going to bed when you want to, going where you want, eating what you want, and you don't have to answer to anybody else. And I definitely have gone on my fair share of solo travels. And I really do love that aspect of it, but I also think that sometimes it's nice to share those memories with people. I think the only part about solo travel I don't love is when you get home and you try to tell people about it and they're just kind of like disinterested because they didn't share that experience with you. But I think Meg has a really great perspective on it. And she talks about really getting comfortable with yourself and basically just creating memories on your own. And I think that's a great skill to learn.
A lot of folks get nervous about the idea of solo travel. If you've never done it, you should try it. See if it's right for you or not. I for the longest time was nervous and I would only book a trip if I could get a friend to go with me. And then eventually it was so much easier to just go by myself. Eventually I just started doing that. And it makes it a lot easier to plan a trip. You don't have to debate with someone else, what are we going to do, where we're going to go. You can make all the decisions exactly as you want. There are obviously downsides. Clearly, a lot of people worry about, being lonely, although you'd be surprised how easy it is to meet people and also how you're more likely to meet people when you don't already have kind of a group with you. So if you're someone who's been thinking about doing a solo trip and you're nervous about it, try it. Try a short little trip and you might like it. I mean, Meg says that it's her preferred method of travel. So a very interesting piece there.
Yeah, I agree. And moving right along, we have Ruthie's piece titled Sunburn, Stairs, and Shade. Here's what I've learned traveling as a redhead. I thought this piece was so interesting. Ruthie's from Wales. She has fair skin and freckles and the red hair. And she talks about some things that she has to consider when she travels that many of us might not have to do when we have darker hair and darker skin. So she says sunbathing is never on her list of priorities. She never goes to the beach really because obviously she gets sunburnt. She said that she also has a lot of interactions with people who will stare at her, especially like when she traveled to Southeast Asia, which is so true. I think so many people over there have never seen a redhead. Like when I went to India with my boyfriend Michael, he's a redhead. He says he's not, but he is. People just flock to him because he's just so unique looking over there. And it's kind of a weird thing to deal with when people are just like drawn to you just because of the way you look when it's not something that you would be used to from where you're from. And then she just talks about how you have to embrace it at some point, which I think is a great idea that, if you stand out, it's okay, but also to stand up for yourself when people do make you uncomfortable, which is a really important thing because if people are taking photos of you and you don't want that, you need to learn how to just address them and, very respectfully be like, that's not cool. So, what did you think about that piece?
I think it's a fantastic piece by Ruthie. It's always interesting to hear other folks' perspectives. For those who aren't watching on YouTube, I'm definitely not a redhead. I'm more of like a increasingly salt and pepper head. But it's really interesting to hear different people's perspectives. Go and read that piece. Great piece by Ruthie. Okay, my next piece, in relation, we were talking about solo travel a minute ago. If you're thinking about a solo travel tip and you want to know where to go, Sky says that Japan is one of the best solo travel destinations. And Sky has done a ton of solo travel to a ton of different places. She says that Japan is great because, first off, it's extremely safe. And she felt comfortable there even as a solo female traveler. She says that public transportation is easy to understand, super punctual, and convenient, so easy to get around. There are a ton of clean and cheap hostels to choose from, including capsule hostels, where those ones where you get inside of a little capsule, so it closes entirely around you, gives you a little bit of privacy. As long as you're not claustrophobic, it can be a fun way to stay. And she said it's surprisingly more sociable than you might think. And she shares her experiences of connecting with other travelers along the way. And she also talks about how she felt like there was a lot of budget options for activities and things to do, and lots of cultural differences that made it really exciting. So she really enjoyed exploring Japan solo. If you're thinking about taking your first solo trip, maybe go give that a read.
Yeah, I do think that Japan is a great solo destination. It does feel very safe. The people are very sweet. I kind of disagree though on the ease of getting around. I had a lot of trouble deciphering signs because a bunch of places that I went to had absolutely no English. So if it weren't for me having a translator on my phone, I would have been so lost. In fact, I did get super lost on the bullet train or not the bullet train, the train in Tokyo. I got lost for like 3 hours on that thing because I had no idea. I missed my stop and I got lost for so long. Nobody could speak English to help direct me. So I would definitely brush up on some Japanese terms and for sure have a translator if you're going to
So
go by yourself.
here's a tip for you, Betty, next time. Johnny Harris has a
Hmm.
great video on YouTube where he talks about this. You don't actually need to read any Japanese in order to navigate the systems there because they use colors and numbers. And if you just look at the signs,
Oh,
it may not make sense to you, but if you understand the system, and he explains it all in his video, I don't remember enough of it, but there is actually a logic to it, and you don't actually need to know Japanese. So I'll try to put a link to that in the show notes.
it's very helpful. What's next for you?
So my final article that I've got to share is from Chelsea. And this is where she says, I love traveling locally. Here's why and how it can make you a better traveler. And basically what she says is, she starts off with the question, how much have you actually seen of the place where you live? And she's talking about people who will go out and travel the whole world, but won't go and visit the things that are close to where they live. She says, I firmly believe that one way to become a better, more confident, and well-rounded traveler is to take a look at the world around you. And there are benefits to doing so, including that it's a lower barrier of entry for new and anxious travelers. It's obviously a lot more affordable. You'll learn how to travel and know more about what kind of traveler you are. It opens your eyes to cool discoveries and hidden gems. You can travel more often and more cheaply because it's so close to you. And obviously, you're discovering all these places that are right around you. So, I thought that was a good one to share. It's a very well-written piece. And in particular relates to the interview that I did, and we're going to jump into a minute with Abigail, because Abigail shares how she's kind of a similar perspective. Most of her travel is around the Denver area and around the Mountain West where she lives. She likes to do a lot of outdoor travel. She has dogs, so she's got to keep those. And she shares in this interview, we're talking about her Ireland trip, which was her first trip abroad in many years. And so it's kind of interesting to hear the perspective of her on that trip. But she was really just emphasizing, Abigail, how that's kind of her preferred method of travel. So I like to say to folks, if you're on a budget, if you don't have a lot of time, if you have other obligations at home, you can still enjoy travel by just looking close to you. And no matter where you live, there probably are people who are traveling there to visit. So try to figure out what it is that they're looking for. We've got lots of great guides to travel Lemming, probably to your hometown. Consider traveling locally.
It's so true. And that's something that I didn't realize really until like COVID times, because I was always planning my next trip out of the country or at least out of the state. And then when I didn't have a choice but to stay, I really started exploring Arizona a lot more, especially the gorgeous outdoor spots that people travel from all over the world to see. I mean, it's not just the Grand Canyon. We've got Sedona. We've got all these really amazing landscapes that are so, so beautiful. And I think starting with local travel is like the best starting point. And then you can get more comfortable with it and go from there.
So that's a nice segue into our next segment, which is an interview that I did earlier this week with Abigail. Abigail is one of our editors. She's based out of Denver, Colorado, and her husband recently took a 10-day whirlwind road trip through Ireland. So Ireland's perennially one of the hottest destinations out there. And so I just wanted to get her perspective on what that trip is. Now, we're going to have lots of interviews on the podcast coming up in the future weeks with Travel Lemming's local experts, people who live in the city and really know the city well. This is a little different than that. This is Abigail sharing her experience as someone who was new to Ireland, what she enjoyed, how she found it. She has some strong opinions about a few things. There's one popular site in particular that she did not really like, and a couple hidden gems that, including the place that she says is the best place to stay she's ever stayed at in her whole life, that she shares. So it was a really interesting interview. And we're going to go ahead and get into that interview. Stick around after, and Betty and I are going to have a few photography tips to you to wrap off the session. But first, let's go ahead and get into that interview with Abigail. So for our next segment, I'm happy to have here with me Abigail Bliss, who you may know as Travel Lemming's Denver editor. Abigail, go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience for those who may not be familiar with your content, and tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to be on the podcast. I have been a local to Denver for almost a decade now, and a lot of my travel is generally local to the Mountain West. My husband and I have two doggies, and so we like to do really long road trips, and we're really into the outdoors. We're skiing, we're hiking, we're doing all the things. And yeah, that's kind of our preferred travel method. And we just recently came back from Ireland, and I'm excited to share a little bit more about a trip that we don't usually take.
Yeah, so let's talk about that trip. Ireland's always a perennially hot destination. A lot of people like to go there. But for you specifically, given that you tend to travel a bit more locally and stay a bit more closer to home, why did you decide to take this trip, and why specifically Ireland?
I have done a little bit of international travel, but it has been almost a decade, even before I moved to Colorado. It's been a long time since I've been on a long flight. My husband's actually had never left the country until this most recent trip, and he had a big birthday. He celebrated his 30th, um, I guess almost 2 years ago now, but we finally made it out for the trip. We had some just personal things come up, a whole kitchen remodel and things. And so the trip was delayed, but we finally made it out. And Ireland has been on his bucket list for as long as I've known him. He has Irish heritage. My mom, too, did a whole ancestry.com thing. And I don't know what percentage I am, but a good chunk of what she is, 30, 40%. And so we kind of was like a heritage trip for us both, where we wanted to see somewhere that was personal to us, but also, again, we're big outdoors people. And so my husband was just drawn to the seascapes, the beautiful green landscapes, and we wanted to do a lot of hiking. And I also felt too, because it's been so long since I've internationally traveled, he has that we kind of wanted to go to a destination that felt almost like entry level. And so because in Ireland, individuals largely speak English, we felt comfortable in that regard. It just felt like a good stepping stone into international travel for us.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, tell us about your itinerary. How long were you there? Where did you go?
Yeah, it almost feels like where do we not go? We didn't head north, but otherwise, I feel like we saw quite a bit of the country, Republic of Ireland specifically, in our time there. So we were there for 10 days. We had a direct flight from Denver to Dublin. We didn't really deal with too much jet lag since we slept for the 9 hours on the way there. We're well rested, hit the ground running. We stayed in the Temple Bar district, which was really cool. Did Jameson Distillery. We ended up going on a rainy bike ride the next morning before heading down south into the Wicklow Mountains. Beautiful hikes there. We did a Smittix tour, and I will say, I think I discovered I like Smittix more than Guinness.
What's Smittix for the folks who are listening?
Smittix is another very well known beer in Ireland. So it's known for its Irish red ale. And yeah, it just has like a really like roasty, malty character to it. I'm a big beer fan. And so I was excited to discover that. And then, yeah, we continued on our road trip to County Cork and then did Blarney Castle, which was something that we almost didn't do. It's kind of known as being a tourist trap for some. And I did see lines. It was funny as we were going up the castle, there was signs that were saying from this point 60 minutes, from this point 90 minutes. And so I'm sure it is busier at other times, but it was really lovely for us. And then spent some time in a small town called Skibbereen. There's the Liss Art Estate down there, which was my favorite stay I think I've ever had. Just really, really gorgeous. So yeah, I stuck around that southwest corner, which I ended up discovering was just my favorite part of the country. We stuck around there for another day and then explored County Kerry, which again, just gorgeous. There's another national park there, Clarny National Park, and then made our way over to the Dingle Peninsula, which another just gorgeous site, tons of cliffs, beautiful coastal hikes, spent some time on the beaches, and then made our way to Cliffs of Moher, which is just a little bit further north in the Dingle Peninsula. So we're kind of looping around that bottom section of the country. I have comments about the Cliffs of Moher. Wasn't my personal favorite destination, but we can maybe get into that a little bit. But from that point, went up to Galway, spent an evening there, did a day cruise out to Inishmore, which is part of the Aran Islands. It's the largest of the islands and was just a really cool day to spend biking around and seeing seals, spending more time on beaches, hiking as we do. And then spent another evening in Galway and then finished up our trip in Connemara National Park, which is just north of that area, another national park. Did some hiking and stayed at a castle, which was really cool and just a really cool way to cap off the trip. And then we shot back to Dublin the next morning and caught a flight back to Denver. So it was a jam packed 10 days.
Yeah, it sounds like you really covered a lot of ground there. I know it's hard to pick, but if you had to pick like one or two things for folks who are planning an itinerary that were favorites or particular standouts that you'd want to draw their attention to, where would those places be?
If you're brave enough to venture off the beaten path, I would highly recommend to stay at Lice Estate. It's down in like the southwest corner. Skibbereen is the name of that town. And it's just, it was my favorite part of the trip. So it's a large estate and it has a couple of different stay options. There's an estate and then there's also some lake houses that you can stay at. And the number of acres, I don't remember, but it was a very large property and felt really private. There were some private hiking trails, some private opportunities to go kayaking and just really take in the nature of that space, the gardens that are there. There was a gorgeous on-site restaurant. The rooms were gorgeous. It was just a very accessible luxury in terms of price point and also just felt like a little romantic getaway. So highly recommend to stay there. There's also an art installation at Lice Art created by an artist by the name of James Turrell, and he does these immersive nature inspired art installations. And it was basically like a grassy dome and a stone plinth or like a stone like slab that you would lay on with two people, feet touching, heads on either on opposite sides. And you just are looking up straight at the sky and just watching the clouds go by. There's kind of like a sound effect to this dome where it kind of blocks out all the external sounds. And so you can really just focus in on what's above you, what's buzzing around you. It was just a really mindful experience that stuck with me since I've gotten back. I recommend to stay at Lice Art Estate. My other favorite destination, I would say, would be the Dingle Peninsula. It really just blew me away in terms of its beauty, the gorgeous hikes that were there. And of course, there's gorgeous hikes all over the world, but I really think like, again, the mix of blues and greens was just really, really striking. And it didn't feel as touristed again as some other areas. It's a little bit further south than the cliffs of Moher, but I would especially recommend venturing a little bit further and doing that, maybe even instead.
Very cool. Couple hidden gems for folks who are planning their Ireland itineraries. Well, let's talk about a destination that probably almost everyone who is going through Ireland will have on their itinerary at some point, which is Dublin. So you started and ended there. You talked about staying in the Temple Bar district, which is of course one of the more touristy districts where a lot of bars are, and there's also a famous Temple Bar there by the same name. Tell us a bit about your experience, your impressions of Dublin, and any advice you would have for folks who are planning going there.
I really enjoyed starting our trip in Dublin. My number one tip would be whether it's in the middle of your trip or beginning otherwise, try to plan it on a weekend because we enjoyed a Saturday night nightlife scene there in Dublin. And I mean, it was just so memorable. I feel like every other door was another fun bar. Every bar had live music, which became a sing along at some point. And so it was just like really charming to be around locals, but other tourists. I stayed at the Nix Hotel, which is right there in Temple Bar. And I mean, the location couldn't have been better. Just the walkability of that district. And it's just so different than the things that I've gotten to see in traveling the United States Mountain West, just in terms of like architecture, the history. It was, yeah, I feel like I could have spent a lot more time in Dublin, honestly.
One of the biggest challenges with Dublin, of course, is its accommodation prices are typically a lot higher than other parts of Ireland. Would you recommend folks to stay in the Temple Bar area? And how did you find that in terms of walkability and all of that? And for the listeners at home, another writer on our site, Matthew, has a guide to where to stay in Dublin that you can use to help plan your trip. But I'm curious to hear your perspective on this, Abigail.
I was only there for one night, 2 days. And so I felt like there was opportunity to splurge a little bit, kind of stay in the district because it was really like that was only the short period of time I was going to be experiencing the city. I would say that if you are visiting for a longer period of time and planning to spend more time in Dublin, the city itself is so incredibly walkable. I was amazed by the walking culture in Ireland as a whole and just how you could really get around town on foot and kind of, get on either end within 30 minutes. So I feel like as long as you have a good pair of walking shoes, you could stay further away from Temple Bar and still very much be able to enjoy those amenities.
Very cool. Any other particular insights or standouts from Dublin?
So I wasn't able to do the Guinness Storehouse tour because I initially thought that I would just be able to go up and see the bar, which I've been told has these beautiful like wraparound glass
Views of
windows.
Dublin. Yeah, I've been there. It's fantastic.
Yeah, and so I really just wanted to go up to the bar. I wanted to see the beautiful views and drink a Guinness, and you apparently have to pay for whatever it was, a $25-$30 ticket just to go to the bar. I didn't need the tour because I knew I was doing Smittix the next day. So yeah, that was a little bit of a bummer. So I wish I had gotten to do that tour. So I would say plan ahead, get your tickets if that's something that's important to you.
I have done the tour, and it is worth it, especially if you like beer. A lot of it's history. It's fun little exhibits. One of the more, it's undeniably tourist, but I would say it's definitely worth doing. Um, okay, speaking of touristy places, you mentioned earlier that the Cliffs of Moher maybe wasn't that wasn't the top of your list, even though it's definitely the most iconic attraction in Ireland. So tell us a bit about that.
I'm sure that at some times of the year or hours of the day, it's an absolutely magical experience. But when I personally went, it was a weekday, but it was midday when we rolled in, and there were tons of tourist buses. Parking was very expensive. We're holding our breath trying to get over to the cliffs and see the sights and make it all worth it. And the coastal walk was entirely closed, which was a big bummer. It was something that I had looked into prior, but I guess my sources weren't up to date. And so we were disappointed to see that the entirety of the cliff walk was closed for safety reasons. But again, I'm outside a lot. I've been to a lot of different parks. I'm not one to disrespect trail closures and understand the need for repair, but it was really frustrating to see a lot of tourists quite literally breaking the fences to continue on the hike anyway. And as somebody who really cares about outdoor stewardship and protection of wild places, it was disappointing to see others acting in that regard. And it was just so crowded. I mean, it was like Disneyland style crowds where you're just shoulder to shoulder with people. And it was, again, just I think especially because I did Dingle Peninsula the day before and just saw, in my opinion, equally as beautiful cliffs, if not as grand, as not as large. They were also very beautiful. And then not to see as many crowds, I would honestly recommend people go there instead.
That's super interesting. Another writer at Travel Lemming, Niam, who's based out of New York City, but has spent a lot of time in Ireland, has an article on the site that I'll go ahead and put up on screen for the listeners on YouTube, where she says, forget the cliffs of Moher, go to Dingle instead. And she says, I recommend visiting Dingle over the famous cliffs of Moher because it has fewer tourists, a rich history, stunning drives. And she thinks it's, in general, kind of the same thing as what you said, that there's a lot of tourists at the cliffs of Moher and that uh, you can find similar scenes in other places. And it is kind of true. So the cliffs are just these very famous cliffs. It's an iconic photo. And so a lot of people want to get it. There are a ton of tour buses that take folks from all over Ireland. I mean, there are day trips that are very popular to take people from Dublin across the entire Isle and go to the other side in order to see these cliffs. And I had fun when I went. I thought it was fun. I would go back. It wasn't as busy during my visit several years ago. However, I can see how it's in my perspective, it's there are a lot of cliffs. Like the whole Wild Atlantic Way, which is the whole coast of Ireland, is filled with cliffs and coastal walks. And many of those have almost nobody in them, or there's a few random pubs or a few other hikers near you. And although the cliffs of Moher are taller and slightly more dramatic, they're not that different than many of the other scenes that you see up and down the coast. So I totally get where both of you are coming from on that. Both you and Liam are sort of enamored with Dingle. So what was it that was so attractive about Dingle in comparison to you?
Aside from the lack of crowds, which I try to avoid crowds, especially in outdoor spaces where you're trying to connect with nature, kind of reset. I like being away from other hikers as much as I can be. But I would also mention too that the way that the history was presented for the two destinations was interesting to me. There was an audio guide that you could listen to there at the Cliffs of Moher, which I thought was insightful and interesting. There was also a small museum that kind of talked about the geology and again the history of the destination. But I just felt like the Dingle Peninsula had this really, really incredible museum that again is such a hidden gem. It's in regards to the Blasket Islands, and I just thought that the way that the museum was designed and presented was so engaging and it felt brand new, like, it smelled brand new. It was such a again, just a gem that presented the history of the place and made you appreciate it all the more. And I just felt like, again, being in the Dingle Peninsula just gave me an opportunity to further appreciate maybe more of a local's perspective of Ireland. We went into a small pub and got to chat with some locals, and I didn't get that vibe when I went to the Cliffs of Moher, where I would say 99% of the individuals there were not from Ireland. So
Okay, very cool. So now let's talk a bit about kind of other standard trip planning things. Sounds like you were moving a lot. You said you didn't drive, but I gather maybe your husband did. Tell us a bit about driving an island and how that was.
So I was a terrified passenger who kept my eyes closed and my mouth shut as best as I could, especially on day one, because we got our rental vehicle in Dublin. And so on day one, we didn't have a car because we were just walking around the city itself. But then on day two, we were heading down into the Wicklow Mountains. Obviously, needed a vehicle for that and the rest of our itinerary. And so coming out of the rental car garage into the busy city center of Dublin was so nerve wracking. You're driving on you're driving on the opposite side of the road, and the roads are so narrow compared to what we're used to here in the United States, especially here on the western side of the country where you have 6-lane highways, and that's kind of the norm of getting around. I mean, things were just so tight, especially then driving down into the Wicklow Mountains. You're driving on these small country roads, and you're coming around a corner supposed to be going 50 miles an hour and it's just blind and there's really not even two space for two cars to be driving next to each other. So it was very nerve-wracking at first, to say the least.
Yeah, so would you recommend renting a car, given everything that you kind of just said?
I absolutely would because I feel like my favorite destinations were the ones that were off the beaten path and lesser accessible by modes of public transportation or in cities. And so even if I were to return to Ireland and didn't have my braver husband driving behind the wheel, I would also rent a car because I just brave it because I wouldn't want to miss out on those sites.
Yeah, especially with so much out in the countryside. Like, I think if you can, it totally makes sense. Now, I have done Ireland just using public transportation. There are trains, there are buses, there are tour groups you can take, but it does limit where you can go. And there were places on that trip that I had to miss because I just couldn't get there efficiently. So when I go next year, hopefully we'll be able to rent a car. A couple other things. Budgeting. How did you find the cost in Ireland relative to, say, the US or other destinations? What should people expect in the finance department?
The cost of traveling through Ireland feels very comparable to major metropolitan areas in the United States, In terms of cost of stays, overall, I felt like they were pretty comparable to what you would see if you were to travel to like Denver, for example. I would say that in the cities, it was significantly more expensive. I would also say, too, like, if you are traveling on a budget, there are ways to do so in Ireland, maybe even more so than major metro areas here in the United States, because I do feel like there's not just like the budget hotels and things like that, but there's also a much larger selection of hostels available. And we did stay in our first ever hostel when we were in Galway. And it wasn't like a dormitory type setting, it was like our own private room, but it was the most affordable place we stayed and met our expectations. It was totally suitable. And so I would say you can make Ireland as expensive as you want, no doubt about it. But I think you can do some things to make it more cost effective.
Okay, so your first time in a hostel, a bit of an aside from the main subject, but how was that? And what were your impressions on hostels?
It was interesting because there in Galway, I felt like we were the only Americans staying there when we were there. I heard so many other languages, largely from other countries throughout Europe. And so I felt like the only American. Again, we didn't get the full hostel experience because we didn't stay in a dormitory, but I really, really appreciated the shared kitchen space. That's something that I don't generally see in places that I've stayed in the United States. And just love the ability to like be able to cook my own food and actually have a real meal and not just a PB&J for dinner. Yeah, I would recommend it. I thought it was, a unique experience and enjoyable.
For listeners who are at home who are maybe on the fence about whether to stay in a hostel, if you want some advice, Laura McFarland from our team just got done with a big trip around the world where she stayed in a ton of hostels. And she's got a post about the sort of unwritten rules at hostels that will help you to prepare for your stay. So you were visiting in September. I mean, Ireland is sort of famously this like rainy sort of destination that has weather that can be a bit moody. How did you find September as a time to go? And what was the weather and climate like?
I feel like we got quite lucky on our trip. We only had one rainy morning when we were in Dublin, and that was day 2 of the trip. The rest of our itinerary was clear skies and largely sunny days. I don't think that's the norm. I had a lot of locals tell us that we were very fortunate and it was the best weather they had seen all year. So I think we just got really lucky when we went in September. I did previously do research and saw that the months of April and June are supposed to be the driest of months, but you can maybe cross your fingers and do the same as we did and visit in September and get lucky.
Okay. Any other particular tips or mistakes or things that you would tell people, someone who's planning a trip to Ireland to kind of think about during the planning process?
I would definitely say book your hotels early. Again, we wanted to do this trip as my husband's 30th birthday celebration, and it ended up being almost 2 years later. And I was planning this trip for almost 2 years, but didn't book my hotels until kind of 2 months out. And I struggled with finding a pretty good selection. The selection was pretty limited and costs were also higher. Definitely plan ahead, book your hotels earlier than I did. And I would also recommend planning ahead personally. That's just how I travel in general. But I feel like we got to do so much within our 10 days and really make our 10-day vacation as packed and fun as it could be without it being stressful by any means. We cut some things as we went along, but I do think that planning ahead will just allow you to see so much more of the country than just kind of winging it.
And so for readers at home, to help you plan ahead, Travel Lemming, we have, I think, 4 or 5 different writers, including myself and Abigail, have some guides sharing our experiences in Ireland. I've got an itinerary that can, if you're planning a road trip, we've got Matthew has guides to Dublin. We've got a number of different guides to different aspects. You can find all those by going to travellemming.com/Ireland, or you can just use your favorite search engine to search Travel Lemming plus whatever the topic is that you're looking for. Okay, well, as we wrap up, any parting thoughts? How do you feel about the trip in general? Are you glad that you picked Ireland? Would you tell folks to go there? And anything else that you want to tell the audience?
I have zero regrets about traveling to Ireland. Again, not a big international traveler, but there are several places on my bucket list. And to be honest, Ireland was not in my top 5. I'm glad that it was in my husband's top 5, though. And it was such a beautiful country. I think the interactions with locals were also positive and engaging. I was just really impressed and would recommend anybody take a trip.
Thank you so much for being with us, Abigail, and telling us about your trip to Ireland. For the listeners at home who want to follow along with you in your adventures in Denver and around Colorado, where's the best place to find you?
Sure, yeah, you can read a lot of my guides on travellemming.com, and you can also follow my adventures on my personal Instagram, abigailrose.bliss.
All right. Thank you so much, Abigail.
Thank you.
Okay, so if you're going to Ireland or anywhere else, you probably are going to be taking photos of your trip. And even if you're not a professional traveler, you probably care how those photos look. So, Betty and I thought in this segment, we would share a few of our best tips for how to just slightly improve your game and become a slightly better travel photographer. Betty, you have a really interesting article on the website where you talk about some of your best tips to take for better photos abroad. So, and I know that you've got a lot of experience as a photographer. You have a photojournalism degree from the University of Arizona. You attended Semester at Sea in 2019 to take a documentary photography class. You've won some prize awards from your university in 4 different categories. What would you say to someone who is new to travel photography and just wants to get, what are some of your best tips for them?
Yeah, so like you said, I mean, I have 10 years of experience as a travel photographer. While never as a true professional where that was like my job, I've really just grown a lot with that and had some really great experiences. So I developed this method I call the 4 C's. And this is what I follow every time I take my DSLR with me, which is pretty much on every trip that I take. So the first C is composition. That's like the most basic element of photography. And the composition includes things like framing and the rule of thirds, which, if you don't know what that is, it's like you divide your frame up into 9 boxes where it's 2 lines across both ways, and you line up the subject right on the crosshairs of a photo. And so there's things like this where it's just such a basic change in your photography that can really change the whole feel of the image that you create. Lighting is massive. I always tell people to shoot either early in the morning or right around sunset. Photographers call this golden hour. That's when the lighting is nice and diffused. It's really nice and warm. If you're shooting during the day, middle of the day, when the sun is right overhead, it's so hard to get a good photo with those harsh shadows. So those are a few of the compositional things. And if you check out my article, I actually have some of the settings I use for nighttime and daytime photography.
And so, what are the other C's after composition?
The next one is culture. I think that this is one of the most fun things to try to capture on your trips. So if you're going somewhere that is right down the road from you or on the other side of the world from you, there's always an element of culture that you can take photos of. So I think it's really powerful. Photography is such a great storytelling tool, and if you can capture the culture of a place with your lens, that's really my goal everywhere I go. I mean, I have photos here of these women in saris in India, which is such a colorful, vibrant culture. And then there's a snake charmer in Morocco, which is so unique to Morocco. It's something I've never seen anywhere else. So yeah, I think getting to capture culture is massive. And the next C is characters. You want to look for interesting people, people who are really expressive, people who have very interesting clothing on, or just have a personality that you can see. And in these photos, I mean, I have a fashionista in Tokyo. I have these really fun, really energetic kids in Casablanca, and then a very sad looking woman in Myanmar. So there's so many emotions you can capture. And I think these characters really bring your photography to life. The final C is confidence. This is something I had to work on for years. I think the first step to being really confident with your photography is knowing your equipment. When I switched from Canon to Sony, I didn't realize how different those cameras were. And I went on an entire trip to China not knowing how to work the camera. And I shot on automatic mode, which is kind of like a cardinal sin in the photography world. And I remember just feeling like, why did I not get to know my camera? And even if you're shooting with an iPhone, it's even though it's a lot easier, it's good to just kind of see what kind of features you have on your camera so that you can capture the images you want. And also having the confidence to go up to people. If you're doing street photography, which is my favorite kind of photography, just asking people permission, can I take your photo? And you have to get comfortable with rejection, which for me has always been really hard. But once you get it a couple of times and people say, no, I don't want you to do that, you move on and you find a new shot. So those are my 4 C's for travel photography.
Any other helpful tips?
I think just again, you can shoot with any kind of camera. I don't want anyone to come away from this thinking, oh, I need to go buy a DSLR now. Like, I have that for very specific reasons, but anyone can be a travel photographer. And it's just such a wonderful way to go back in time to a moment that you had somewhere that you may never go again. So it's just a really fun element of travel that I think everyone can enjoy.
Interesting. Yeah. So that ties in on my first tip. So my first tip is the best camera is the one that you have on you. And I used to shoot with a DSLR. Right before I left for my big trip around the world after I quit my job, my uncle, who was a wildlife photographer, talked me into buying a camera. And he said, listen, if you're going to go to all these incredible places, you should really at least be able to learn the basics of how to take some good photos. You're going to thank yourself later. And I tell you, if he hadn't had that conversation with me, Travel Lemming might never have existed, because it was during that trip, I got started learning travel photography, which ultimately led to me deciding to create the Travel Lemming in the first place. So for the first few years, I would shoot with a DSLR. I also would do a lot of drone shots. Back in the day, it was easier to fly drones. Now they're restricted everywhere. And I was very much into all of the fancier sort of settings and things. Now, a few years ago, the iPhone, starting with around the iPhone, I don't know, 14 or so, or it's started to get so good in the sense of the cameras were just such high quality that, I started to realize, like, man, is sometimes I would just leave my DSLR and just use the camera and the iPhone camera. And the thing is that I would take so much more photos, because with the iPhone, it's just easier to pull it out and take the photo. Whereas the DSLR, you have to take off the cap, clean the lens. You're trying to protect it. You don't want to dig it out of the bag. And so I ditched my DSLR a couple years back because I found I wasn't using it enough. And now most of the photos that I take on Travel Lemming are with an iPhone. And so your smartphone camera can do a lot more than you think. As Betty says, the first thing you want to think about is composition. What is actually in the frame? When she's talking about the rule of thirds, the idea there is that sometimes you don't actually want to center your subject. Sometimes it can be more interesting to have it off center on one of those grid lines. The iPhone has a feature where you can turn on those grid lines, and you can use those grid lines in order to kind of position your camera. Those of you who watched our first couple of podcasts on YouTube might notice that I accidentally had a grid line feature turned on my camera the whole time. So you can go look at that for an example.
You
And
just love the feature so much.
yeah, exactly. It is very helpful for making sure that you're positioning things right and you're thinking about what is in each one of those sections. So like a classic rule of thirds would be if you're doing like a shot of the beach, and your top, you would put the sky, and in the middle, you would kind of have the ocean, and then the bottom, you would have the sand, and then you would position your subject on the left or right grid line. And then that would make you a nice little composition where kind of all of it is neatly put there. Another thing that I think a lot of people who are, if you're really new and you're just like, oh, look, mate, this sounds like a lot. I just want my photos to like not look awful. One of the biggest mistakes see people making is that they shoot into the sun. Like, move and try to position yourself so that you have the sun at your back. If you're trying to shoot towards the sun with especially with a smartphone camera, that's going to be really challenging. And then my last tip is to just be patient. And this is particularly for those shots where you want yourself or maybe someone else in your family or your partner to have a shot in front of somewhere that is iconic or really busy. Very often, if you're trying to recreate a shot off of Instagram or somewhere else, there's going to be a lot of other people there. And one tip, as Betty said, is to go early or go late. You'll have the benefit of golden hours. And especially if you wake up at dawn, there'll probably be fewer people there. But even if there are people, you can still very often find a break in the crowd just by waiting. And so you have to talk to whoever is shooting you or you're shooting with, and just tell them, find your pose, hold your pose, and just wait. And just wait for your moment. If there's someone behind you that's kind of messing up the shot, don't be afraid of just waiting there for a minute or two. If it's a really beautiful shot and that person is kind of breaking it up, wait, and then maybe somebody else will come through and just relax. And in the meantime, you can enjoy the fact that you're at this amazing, beautiful site where you are. And then you'll get your moment where you can snap. And all you need is a second, and that patience will really pay off. And lastly, I guess one more thing I would say for those of you who do want to like be in photos and pose, a lot of people, as Betty says, like confidence is really helpful. One way to build that confidence is to find 3 or 4 poses that you can snap into that you really kind of work for you. One pose I do a lot is I will kind of like stand and I will have one of my legs slightly bent forward, one of my knees bent forward, and I'll put a hand on it and I'll kind of like look out. And it's just something that I found I feel good how I look like that. I feel confident in that pose and I can snap into that pose instantaneously. Because when you are the model and someone else is taking the photo of you, the worst thing you can do is be moving around a lot. So when you're posing for a photo, you want to pose and get in your pose, be confident, freeze, hold it, and then let them be patient and wait for that moment to take the beautiful photo. So hopefully those tips will help you level up your photography for those of you at home. Again, Betty's got a whole article that you can find on travellemming.com/perspectives. Let us know in the comments what your thoughts are on photography. If you were traveling, you might as well get your camera out. You might as well take some memories, even if it's just for your own personal memories. And you might as well, try to make them a little bit better if you can. So that's my thoughts on that.
Yes, thank you so much for all of those additional great tips, Nate. And it takes time too. Like, I'm the world's worst model. I move so much. So everything you're saying, you're describing me to a T. I drive my boyfriend crazy because I'm like, take a photo of me. And then every single one I'm unhappy with. So I still have a lot of learning to do too. It takes time and you're never going to be perfect, but taking photos or being in the photos, just have fun with it and take a lot, because then you'll at least be able to sift through them and hopefully get one that you enjoy. And with that, we're going to move right along to our sponsor message. And we are our own sponsor. Travel Lemming, we have our local creators who are here to help you plan your next best trip. We have over 1,500 guides from all over the world. We also have some really wonderful perspectives, as well as community meetups in 7 cities right now, one of which is Phoenix, where I am the host. We also have Chicago, Denver, Nashville, San Juan, Puerto Rico, Seattle, and Vancouver, and soon to be San Francisco.
We
Is that
just
right,
added
Nate?
San Francisco, I think a day or two ago.
Oh, very exciting. So yeah, we would love to meet you in person. We also would love it if you liked and subscribed to the podcast and let us know your thoughts and opinions on everything that we discuss. We want to hear from you. We want to grow from you. And we hope that you feel like we're useful to you as well in return.
All right. Well, that's it for this podcast. As Betty said, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. That really helps us out with those algorithms. Quick preview for you of the next podcast. It's all about Disney World. And I had an incredible interview that I've actually already recorded with Katie, who is our local Disney World guide. She worked for a dozen years as a cast member at Disney World. And we talk about so much stuff. It's a really long, lengthy interview. It's going to be slightly more of a different format of a podcast where we've got this like really detailed interview with everything you could possibly want to know about Disney. And if you're someone who's like, hey, Nate, Disney's not for me, like, I think I'll skip that one. That's actually the first thing that we talk about, which is why people who are Disney skeptics might want to reconsider that. So be sure to turn in for the next one. Thank you so much. And we'll see you in the next podcast.
Thanks so much. See you soon.